All right, so my camera is not working today. My apologies. Hopefully I'll get that fixed. I have no idea what's happening, but I've hit my limit on trying to figure it out. So we're going to start with Chapter 8. There's a brief part of Chapter 7 that we're going to cover, which is basically just an overview of different types of markets with two little indexes that we're going to cover. But really the bulk of our work is going to be in Chapter 8. So this is the part of the semester where everything comes together. If you've been following along and doing well, I think this part will be easy and interesting, so let's hope that that's the case. So there are four types of market structures: perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. This is not news to any of us. We know these general properties, so this is a review. Perfect competition, many small firms and consumers relative to the market. There's no market power. No one has any control over price. That's important for today. Firms produce very similar products. We call those homogeneous products or homogeneous. And there's no market power. So what happens is firms optimize where price equals marginal cost. Monopoly is the other extreme. There's one producer and there is market power, so the price is greater than the marginal cost in the long run, and there will be profits. So this notion that price equals marginal cost means there's zero profits in the long run. Monopolistic competition is perhaps the most useful because there's a lot of students who will probably work at one of these. But basically there's many small firms and consumers relative to the market. The firms produce slightly different products, so there is product differentiation, and there's limited market power. So the best example of this is like hair salons, right? So there's lots of hair salons in town here. Slightly different products, different, atmospheres. Some are fancy, some are geared toward men, whatever. But there's limited market power. And then, of course, there's oligopoly, where there's a few large firms that tend to dominate the market. Price and marketing strategies are mutually interdependent with other firms. Best example of this is airlines, right? There's not very many people providing airline services. So if United runs a sale, Southwest is going to notice that. So what happens is the perfect competition is the easiest one to study, and that's why we start with that. That's why we assume this for supply and demand. Monopoly is a little more difficult, but still one of the simpler ones. Monopolistic competition, we can use the neoclassical tools to study it. Once we get to oligopoly, it becomes more difficult. And so with oligopoly, you basically need game theory, which is high-level math, in order to really have, understand the modern models. So we'll go through one or two in this class, but they're not going to be like the game theory models. This is just something for your reference. This is from my other textbook. I find this helpful. In particular, market entry is easy to see here. Perfect competition, it's very easy to enter. Like if you think about growing corn, I could start growing corn. Monopolistic competition, yeah, I could start a hair salon. No one would come, right? Oligopoly, it's very difficult. Yeah, I'm going to start an airline, right? And then monopoly it's very difficult or impossible. Non-price competition refers to do you differentiate your product? That's also up here, but it's like, do you compete in other ways? Like a restaurant might offer music, right? Like music at the table. There's this Mexican restaurant that has a mariachi band. That's non-price competition. So it's impossible for perfect competition. It is possible for monopolistic competition, etc. So you can feel free to use this as you wish. So the only thing that we're taking from Chapter 7 is this notion of measuring industry concentration. The only reason I'm teaching you that is so that you can see the chart on the next couple pages. Okay, so this is something I do teach it in my classes, but it's mostly just useful to analyze the actual data. So there are two measures economists use to gauge the degree of concentration in an industry. The first is the four-firm concentration ratio. And this is basically, of the top four firms, how concentrated are they? So this would be the top firm, second firm, third firm, fourth firm. and then you divide it by the total production. I'll go through an example, it'll make more sense. And then we've got the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which you do. I think this formula is actually really confusing. Each of the firms in the market, like all of them, even if there's 10,000 firms, you take their market share, say it's 5%, you square it, and then you add those together, and you multiply them by 10,000. So you're going to get a value between 0 and 10,000, and a monopoly would be 10,000. So let's go through this example here. Suppose an industry is composed of 6 firms. 4 firms have sales of $10 each, and 2 firms have sales of $5 each. What is the 4-firm concentration ratio? We're only going to care about the top 4 firms. Okay, so the first thing we need is total industry sales, and you just add all of them together, including the 2 that aren't going to be included in this index. So it's $50 total, $50 total of sales. The 4 largest firms are responsible for 40 of that, right? 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10, that's 40. So you take the production of the 4 largest firms, or the sales, divided by the total sales, that's 0.8. So the 4 largest firms in the industry account for 80% of total industry output. It's intuitive, it's helpful, but it's limited, right? We're only looking at 4 firms. The Herfindahl-Hirschman index, if we were to compute it here, you'd say, okay, the market share of the first firm is 10 out of 50, square it. Second firm, 10 out of 50, square it, etc. Notice that we're including the 5th and 6th largest firms as well. So we would get 1912.5. So this is why I taught you this. It's really helpful for me to see real world examples of this. So if you look at breweries, right? The 4-firm concentration ratio. The top 4 firms are responsible for 90% of sales. Wow, right? Like Anheuser-Busch actually has bought up a lot of microbreweries responsible for lots of sales. Distilleries at 70, electronic computers 87. Let's look down at furniture, right? So furniture is quite low. The top 4 furniture producers are only responsible for 11% of sales. That makes sense. Furniture is probably monopolistic competition, right? There's more furniture producers. Snack foods, surprisingly high. If you look at like Kraft and the processed food market, it's actually quite concentrated. Let's see, motor vehicles, quite concentrated, things like this. All right, and then we look over at the HHI, and we can see for furniture, it's super low, right? It's like close to 0, which is about it is as low as you can get. And so you can kind of see the 2 different measures at work here. So if I was to say, what is the most concentrated industry of all of these industries, I would say breweries. If I say, what is more concentrated, distilleries or motor vehicles, I would say, it depends what you're looking at, right? An economist's favorite answer. If you look at the 4-firm concentration ratio, distilleries is more concentrated. The HH ratio, motor vehicles is more concentrated. So are there limitations? Yes, there are. I'm not really going to go through these. If you're teaching this in your class, it might be helpful for you to have this information, but okay, it's still a helpful measure. All right, so now we're going into chapter 8 here, and we're starting with perfect competition. Why would we start with this, right? It's not realistic. Even with corn, right? Like corn is a good example of perfect competition, or it's like the best example, but still, corn is not homogeneous. There's organic corn, there's genetically modified corn, there's sweet corn, whatever. The reason we start with it is it's the easiest. So once you understand perfect competition, the rest is going to make much more sense. So, perfectly competitive markets are characterized by the interaction between many buyers and sellers that are small relative to the market. Each firm produces a homogeneous good. Buyers and sellers have perfect information. This is something, if you talk about like banking, people question this assumption of perfect information. There's things like moral hazard, adverse selection, where we question this assumption. Corn, yeah, I know the price of corn, right? Like, I know what other people are paying. No transactions cost, that just helps the model work better. and then free entry and exit from the market. So in the long run, not the short run, in the long run, firms can enter and exit as they please. The implications of these conditions are a single market price is determined by the interaction of demand and supply, and perhaps most importantly, firms earn zero economic profits in the long run. So I always ask my students, what would you rather be? Of all the market structures, would you rather be a monopolist, an oligopolist, perfectly competitive market? I don't want to be this, right? You make zero profit. So here we go. So this is like the fundamental assumption of this model. This is why it's easier. If you look at the market's on the left here, we get a price determined by the market. A firm faces a perfectly elastic demand curve. Okay, so a firm has a perfectly elastic demand curve. Why is that? If a firm tries to charge a higher price, the quantity demanded will be zero. All the other people are charging $5 a bushel for corn. You try to charge $6. It's the same corn, right? It's homogeneous. So your quantity demanded is going to drop down to zero. If you think about charging a lower price, well, it's actually just irrational, right? Why would you ever drop the price? Because you can see here that you can sell an infinite amount at the market price. So this is an important distinction of this type of market. So let's just keep in mind, this is the short run. Some factors of production are fixed. To maximize short run profits, managers must take as given that there's fixed inputs and fixed costs to determine how much output to produce by changing the variable inputs. It's all coming together from the cost chapter. So we've got that perfectly elastic demand curve. Something that happens here, the demand curve for a competitor's product is a horizontal line. And so demand is equal to the price is equal to marginal revenue. So if we think back to, I think it was chapter 3 in your book, what marginal revenue is, the additional revenue of selling one more, that's important to note here. So let's go to the first worksheet here. Actually, let's just go to the first table. We're just going to look at this here. All right, so I've got this example that we're going to be working with today. Now, we've got quantity goes up, price stays the same. Why is that? Because it's perfectly elastic. If you try to charge $1.11, your quantity demand is going to drop down to zero. So this is your demand curve over here. Total revenue is equal to price times quantity. Now, marginal revenue, additional revenue of producing one more, or additional revenue of selling one more. You take this minus this. If I go from 0 to 1, my additional revenue is 110. If I go from 1 to 2, it's 110. There we go. This is why it's the simplest market to cover. Marginal revenue is constant and related to price. Why is that? Because if we go back to the graph, the firm has no market power, right? Whatever is determined in the market, they're stuck with. But they can sell an infinite amount at that market price. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pause, and I would like you guys to pull up Chapter 8, Worksheet 1. There's the 2 tables along with it, and see if you can figure out how the firm is going to decide output.